Saving throws are one of the most foundational elements of many spells in Dungeons & Dragons. The thing is though, that a lot of people likely aren't considering which saving throw their spells are targeting. It more or less just ends up being a consequence of the spell that they select. But which spells you pick, and by extension, the saving throw that they target, can have a significant impact on the likelihood that any of those spells land and impact their target. So in this video, we are going to discuss which saving throws are the best and worst to target if you're the caster, and then evaluate what some of the best options might be at each spell level, depending on your class. Quick disclaimer here, this kind of thing is not going to matter to some people, and that is completely fine. This is definitely not how I choose my spells when I play, but it doesn't mean that I don't find it very interesting, and I also think that there are a lot of people out there who will get value out of this and be very interested in the results as well. So with that, let's take a look. Also, I should mention that all of this data is compiled exclusively using the 2024 Monster Manual and Player's Handbook. There is nothing pre-2024 here, and it's also obviously not considering spells made using attack rolls. It is just saving throw spells. So before we can look at the best and worst spell options, the first thing we'll need to do is to determine what are the best and worst saving throw stats on the monsters themselves. For this, I worked with my friend and the guy that makes my thumbnails, Julio, to help me extract all of the raw data from every single monster in the new Monster Manual. This took a ton of time and work, so feel free to drop a sub to the channel and like the video while you're there. It helps so much more than you think. Now though, the answer to this question is a bit complicated and varies throughout different points in the game. So what I decided to do was break things down by tier of play and then cross-reference that table with the one in Xanathar's Guide to Everything for a party of 4 to determine what creatures you would be fighting within each tier. I know that probably sounded like a bit of a garbled mess, but what it means is essentially as follows. Tier 1 is levels 1 to 4, which comprises CRs 1/8 through CR 4. I ignored CR 0 for the purposes of this video. Tier 2 is levels 5 to 10, which comprises CRs 5 through 12. Tier 3 is levels 11 to 16, which comprises CRs 13 through 19, and Tier 4 is levels 17 to 20, which comprises CRs 20 through 22. I then also wanted to include the remaining monsters that were higher than CR 22, since there's just not all that many. There is a column that's going to be labeled above, which indicates all of the monsters from CR 23 to 30, and you'll see those a little bit later. So with that breakdown done, the next step was to figure out what the average saves were across each ability score and within each tier of play. So that's exactly what I did. For example, we can see here that the average strength save in tier 1 is 1.4. This was done exactly as you would expect. We took all the values for strength saving throws for every monster between CR 1/8 and CR 4 and averaged them out. And yes, of course, there are going to be some outliers in every category, but this does give us a reasonable representation across the board. And it's at least consistent since the methodology is identical for every save in every tier. Now, with that methodology explained, let's take a look at what we've got. In tier 1, representing levels 1 to 4, the worst monster save is Intelligence, with an average of -1.6. Then it's Charisma with an average of -1.2, followed by Wisdom with 0.6. Then we get to Strength and Constitution, which tie at 1.4, and finally Dexterity becomes the worst save to target here with a 1.6. What this means is that if we statistically want to have the best chance for our saving throw spells to land between levels 1 and 4, we should ideally be selecting spells that target Intelligence or Charisma. Wisdom is not a terrible pick either, but generally speaking, we should probably try and avoid anything that targets Dexterity, Strength, and Constitution. Armed with this information, we can now take a look at all of the spells available to us within Tier 1, which is everything from cantrips to second level spells, and see what makes for a good pick. As a reminder, the core of this video is to focus on the probability of our spell landing. Unless otherwise specified, that is what comprises a good or bad pick. Some spells will absolutely be worth taking despite targeting a quote-unquote bad save, but that's just not the general focus of this video. Oh, and also upcasting is obviously a thing, but the goal here is to try and generally evaluate things based on when you would get access to certain spells at the same time that you would be expected to be fighting certain monsters. I know I'm probably still going to get a bunch of comments about this, but at least I can now point to this timestamp. Looking at cantrips, we don't have a lot of options to begin with. There are only 7 cantrips that target saving throws, and of those, only 1, Mind Sliver, targets Intelligence. This makes it the clear winner if it's available to you to pick. So sorcerers, wizards, and warlocks will feel great about being able to grab this. Unfortunately, there are no cantrips that target Charisma saves, which is our only other save with an average modifier in the negatives. So with that, we move to Wisdom, which is teetering on the brink of being good, which makes things like Toll the Dead a solid pick for clerics, and Vicious Mockery is also a reasonable pick for bards. Sacred Flame, which is generally considered to be a solid spell, ends up being a bad pick for the purposes of this video just due to the average dex save being so much higher. Moving on to first level spells, there's actually none that target intelligence saves, which is kind of a bummer. However, we do get exactly one that hits charisma, and that's Bane, an overall fantastic spell that is available to bards, clerics, warlocks, and Oath of Vengeance paladins, which makes it both fairly accessible and with a strong likelihood of landing. As far as wisdom saves go, the standouts here are things like Command, Charm Person, Dissonant Whisper, Sleep, and Tasha's Hideous Laughter. You'll notice here that bards actually do incredibly well in this range, not only getting Bane, but also getting access to the other 4 spells that I just mentioned. The classes that don't end up doing that well here are druids and rangers. The best spell available to druids here is probably Charm Person if we're considering probability of landing as the key metric. Beyond that, the other spells they have here that are also generally considered good would be Entangle or Thunderwave, but they target strength and constitution saves respectively, which makes them pretty bad picks here since monsters have a much better shot at saving against them. And things don't really look much better for rangers, except I guess Hail of Thorns kinda helps out a bit. But I guess it doesn't matter since they're only going to be casting Hunter's Mark anyway. Paladins don't get a whole lot here, but Wrathful Smite and Command are certainly going to be their best picks. And as you'd expect, Sorcerers, Warlocks, and Wizards all do reasonably well, getting access to a good variety of spells that also target Intelligence and Charisma. Moving on to second level spells, we get another Intelligence one in the form of Phantasmal Force, which has an incredible potential as a spell. In my tier ranking videos, I even dropped this in S tier. This makes it a no-brainer pick for bards, sorcerers, and wizards. As far as charisma spells go, we get Calm Emotions and Zone of Truth. Both of these are situationally useful, so it's hard to call them must-haves for pretty much any reason, even though they target good saves. There are a ton of wisdom spells to choose from here, but the problem is that a few of them, like Crown of Madness and Enthrall, are just so bad that they truly end up dropping the value of wisdom down by quite a bit. Make no mistake though, there are still plenty of good wisdom spells though, like Detect Thoughts, Mind Spike, Whole Person, and Suggestion. This basically leaves us with Dexterity, Strength, and Constitution spells. And again, some of these are terrible, even ignoring their saves like Cordon of Arrows. But some, like Moonbeam, Heat Metal, and Web, are almost certainly still worth taking in spite of those saves. Heat Metal is actually a bit of a special case, since the saving throw is almost entirely irrelevant as it's so often cast on armor, which means that the target can't drop it, so the save kinda doesn't matter. Fortunately for druids, second level spells end up being a little bit kinder to them than their first level spells were. They get pickups like Heat Metal, Moonbeam, and Flaming Spear, which can all be pretty solid. Bards also do quite well, as explained earlier, and the same is largely true of Warlock, Sorcerers, and Wizards. Sadly, our poor Rangers only get Cordon of Arrows and Gust of Wind, which is just brutal. Moving on to Tier 2, we see a little bit of movement in our rankings. In Tier 2, Intelligence is still the best save to target with an average modifier of 0.7. Then it's Charisma with a 1.7. Then, interestingly, it flips to Dexterity, which is now at 2.9. Moving into the top half, we then have Wisdom with a big jump to an average of 3.3, Strength with an average of 4.3, and Constitution topping us off with a 4.4, which, for all intents and purposes, is functionally the same as Strength. In Tier 2, we cover levels 5 to 10, which means that we span spell levels 3, 4, and 5. As a reminder, this also represents monsters from CR5 through CR12. Intelligence and Charisma are still distinctly the best saves to target here, but what is interesting is how close Dexterity ends up being now. And it's over a full point jump to Strength and Constitution, which end up being tied for being terrible to target. So, what does this tell us? Well, as we move into Tier 2, some of those dexterity spells that you could probably upcast from earlier are likely going to be more reliable hits. I know that I said I wasn't going to be considering upcasting, but that's basically the extent of it, and it is worth keeping in mind. First up in this tier, we get to our third level spells, and this is an interesting one since there's nothing that targets intelligence and the only charisma save is Magic Circle, which is fine, but it's also fairly situational, so it's not really moving the needle for us. But where things do get really interesting are the wisdom saves. Yes, we do get Bestow Curse, which is kind of bad, but we also get some total bangers here in the form of Fear, Hypnotic Pattern, and Slow, all three of which are available to Bards, Sorcerers, Warlocks, and Wizards, except Slow, which Warlocks don't get. These are all the kinds of spells that are totally worth picking despite their saving throw. And that being said, Wisdom is still just not terrible here. Another incredible pick that clerics get at level 3 is Spirit Guardians. I've talked about this spell before in past videos, and it's just incredibly beyond ridiculously good and was made even better in 2024, so this is definitely a big win for clerics. If we start veering into the worst saves, we do end up looking at Conjure Animals, which, despite targeting a dexterity save, is still probably worth taking if you're a druid or ranger, just because of the sheer amount of targets that it has the potential to hit every round. So yeah, you're not looking at a great save, but I mean, law of averages, you're gonna hit something. Sadly for rangers though, they're gonna have to wait quite a while before they can actually take it. The other spell that is worth talking about at level 3 is kind of the elephant in the room, and that is Counterspell. Famously, this was changed to be a Constitution saving throw in 2024, and here we can see why this upset a lot of people, as Constitution is just a bad save to target. I will say that on the flip side of that, so many spell-like effects were transposed into actions that the impact of the Counterspell change is probably not as impactful as the change to action economy in general. I still think that Counterspell is a solid pick, despite it hitting Constitution. Looking at our level 4 spells, once again we have nothing that hits Intelligence, which is a shame. But we do get exactly one spell that hits Charisma, and again, it's a banger. Banishment. This is an iconic and incredibly powerful spell, which makes it a great pickup for clerics, paladins, sorcerers, warlocks, and wizards. The only downside is that it's a save or suck spell, which isn't ideal, but it's still absolutely worth the pick. Next, we can look at our dexterity spells, of which we have quite a few, but the unfortunate part is that most of them are just not that great. We have things like Guardian of Faith, Mordenkainen's Faithful Hound, and Vitriolic Sphere. These are all kinda mid at best and probably still not worth taking, despite the fact that they target an okay save. The flip side of that are spells like Ice Storm, Odaluk's Resilient Sphere, and Wall of Fire, which, while not being amazing by any stretch, are still likely worth the pick in some cases. Moving up into the worst saves, we do end up with spells with incredibly powerful effects like Charm Monster, Confusion, and Phantasmal Killer. These again are spells that are likely still worth the pick despite their save, and are great for bards, wizards, and druids, except Phantasmal Killer, which they can't actually take. Looking at Constitution saves, there's only two on the entire list, Blight and Fount of Moonlight. One is atrociously bad, and the other is incredibly good. Blight is just an awful pick, only made worse by its save. Fount of Moonlight, on the other hand, is a genuinely great spell that still provides an effect on yourself regardless of whether or not the target saves. This makes it a great choice for both bards and druids. Another standout at this level is obviously Conjure Woodland Beings, or as I lovingly call it, the Spinning Beyblade of Death. It doesn't matter that it's a wisdom save. If you want to kill everything and you're a druid or ranger, just take the spell. Unfortunately for rangers though, they're not going to get this until a lot later. Moving on to level 5 spells, we finally get another intelligence save, and what a good one it is. Synaptic Static is an excellent pick for bards, sorcerers, warlocks, and wizards. Yes, it deals fireball damage for 2 spell levels higher, but it's significantly likelier to land and has an ongoing debuff that can truly pay dividends for your party. Looking at our charisma spells, we actually have quite a few here. Banishing Smite is an okay pick for paladins, but it's just not the best smite spell option. Dispel Evil and Good is just so niche that it's kind of a bad pick like 95% of the time anyway. Planar Binding has some crazy wombo combos, but the charisma save isn't targeting enemies here. Seeming is also a really fun and solid spell, but again, it's unlikely you're targeting this toward an unwilling creature. So this makes for something of a weird situation where we finally get a ton of potentially good save spells to choose from, but none of the options are particularly relevant to us. If we look at dexterity saves, we have exactly 2 options here. Conjure Volley, which is only available to rangers, and therefore technically a tier 4 spell, but it's a hell of a spell for what it's worth. The only other choice we get is Flame Strike, which is kinda mid. Looking at Wisdom, Strength, and Constitution spells, there are still some picks here that are worth grabbing despite their save. Dominate Person and Hold Monster can be clutch if you're a bard, sorcerer, warlock, wizard, and some other subclasses which get them too. Scrying is also an incredible grab if you're almost any class, especially since you have the ability to directly influence the modifier of the spell depending on what items or knowledge you might have. Moving on to tier 3, which is levels 11 to 16 and monsters CRs 13 through 19, we have some more big changes in our save to look at. Again, as you'd expect, Intelligence is certainly still the best save to target, with an average of 3. But then things get more interesting from there. Both Charisma and Dexterity are now tied with a 4.6. This is kind of funny since it ends up close to the Strength and Constitution saves from tier 2. Moving up, our next worst save is actually Strength for the first time coming in this low, but it's actually a huge jump from those previous lower saves, with this one sitting at a 6.3. But things only get worse from there, with Wisdom being our next worst, averaging 6.9, and Constitution once again topping us off with a whopping 7.3. In previous tiers, it was easier to justify hitting the quote-unquote bad saves since the spread wasn't that extreme. But in tier 3, this becomes a bit harder to accept since the delta between the good and bad are pretty steep now. Anyway, in tier 3, we cover spells level 6, 7, and 8, so let's take a look. At level 6, we get exactly 0 intelligence spells, sadly. And then the only charisma save we get is Magic Jar, which is a good spell, but it is also one that requires a particular setup or use case, and it's not something you're likely just going to be spamming during combat encounters. Spells like Blade Barrier, Chain Lightning, and Disintegrate make for reasonable picks. Disintegrate is good if for no other reason than to potentially be able to destroy walls of force should the need arise. Interestingly, we get no strength spells here either. This moves us up into the territory of Wisdom and Constitution, which are pretty hard to recommend in this range. Eye Bite and Mass Suggestion are good picks for bards, sorcerers, and wizards. Circle of Death isn't too terrible for warlocks either, just a question of whether it's really worth your Mystic Arcanum. While Blade Barrier isn't bad, our poor clerics don't really do well here, getting Harm and Sunbeam, which are 2 single target Constitution spells. Moving on to level 7, again, we have no intelligence spells to speak of, but we do get 2 options for Charisma: Divine Word and Force Cage. Divine Word has some niche applications, either needing to be cast on some specific types of creatures or ones that have already almost died, so it makes it a bit harder to recommend. That said, the effects that it does create are very powerful, so it's by no means a bad option for clerics. Force Cage, though, is an incredibly powerful spell at just shutting down an encounter. It's also worth noting that the charisma save is not to see whether the spell takes effect or not, it just always works. The charisma save is to see whether or not the creature trapped inside is able to get out afterward. This makes Force Cage a fantastic option to just end encounters outright. The biggest downside here is the change made in 2024 that makes the spell consume 1,500 gold worth of ruby dust, so it's probably not going to be something that you're going to be using all the time. Looking at dexterity spells, we've got some fun ones here, like Prismatic Spray, Reverse Gravity, and Delayed Blast Fireball, all of which are spells that I have had great moments with in-game. There's also not a single Wisdom or Strength spell here, and our only Constitution spell is Finger of Death, and it should be pretty obvious why that's not going to be a great pick at this point. Finally, in tier 3, we have our level 8 spells, and we do get a great intelligence pick here: Befuddlement. This used to be called Feeble Mind. They changed the name and the effect a little bit. The spell can create a very powerful effect, but there is something slightly misleading about our likelihood of landing. Since the spell prevents the target from casting spells or taking the magic action, it means that you are more likely to be casting it on spellcasters, who also have a higher chance at having stronger intelligence modifiers or being proficient in the save. If you cast this on an Archmage, for example, they've got a +9 to their intelligence saves. That said, there are plenty of other spellcasters in the game that don't have such high intelligence modifiers, so it's just one that you're likely going to want to pay attention to. Unfortunately, we have no charisma options, but we do get a couple of dexterity spells to choose from: Earthquake and Incendiary Cloud. Unfortunately, neither are particularly great. Earthquake is fine in some specific situations, or if you just want to run around collapsing everything in sight. Incendiary Cloud is basically Cloud Kill, just more expensive. Sadly for druids, both of these options means that they aren't getting a whole lot at this level, especially since Tsunami is targeting a strength save. As far as wisdom goes, Dominate Monster has the potential to be an incredibly powerful spell, so is probably still worth picking. Holy Aura is also just a solid pick here, and I've had a player use this one to great effect during my games. The Constitution save is just to see if the creature ends up being blinded after it attacks, but you still get the main benefit of the spell regardless. This is a solid choice for clerics. And finally, we hit tier 4, which is level 17 through 20 and CRs 20 through 22. We've got some more big changes in our average saves here. Firstly, Intelligence is obviously still the best at target, which is hilariously tied with Strength from tier 2, sitting at 4.3. Then we actually have some big jumps. Charisma is now sitting at 6.1, Strength is 7.3, Dexterity is 7.9, Constitution is 8.4, and topping us off, amazingly, is Wisdom with an average of 9.3. Now, this tier also only contains level 9 spells, and what's kind of funny about that is that there are currently exactly 6 level 9 spells targeting saves in the game, and they only hit Wisdom, Dexterity, and Constitution, the 3 worst saves to target. I wonder what the odds of that were. One thing that is worth pointing out is that the Wisdom save on True Polymorph is, again, if you're casting it on an unwilling creature. So if you're doing it to yourself or an ally, you don't need to worry about that, which makes this a great pick. Everyone's favorite Meteor Swarm is targeting a high save, but comparatively next to Wisdom, it's not looking that bad. My favorite spell in the game, Prismatic Wall, hitting Constitution makes it a bit sadder, but I still think it's cool as hell. Really, when you're at level 9, just pick the cool spells. What else even matters at that point? One final thing I did want to touch on are all of the monsters that are above tier 4, so these represent the guys from CRs 23 through 30. Now, there are currently not that many here since we are just looking at the new monster manual, but I know that high level groups often fight these big baddies, so let's take a look. Here, our boy Intelligence continues to be the best save to target and ends up with a massive dip going down to 3.1. The next best is Charisma sitting at 5.9, then it's Dexterity at 7.5, Wisdom at 9.1, Constitution at 10.7, and finally, topping the rankings for the first time is Strength with a massive 11.2. To clarify though, again, this is being skewed by the Kraken's ridiculous plus 17 strength save modifier, and because there are just not that many creatures in this range, it heavily skews it. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed that and found something of value to take from it. And let me know in the comments what surprised you. I know there was a lot that caught me off guard. I do plan to do some more analysis of monsters with the new monster manual to see what else we can learn, so be sure to subscribe for more. A huge shout out to all of my patrons, but especially those in the Elderbrain tier. You guys are incredible. I'll give a particular shout out to Finichi since I also just found out that I've been pronouncing his name wrong for like over a year, so sorry about that. Anyway, check out some of my other videos, but otherwise, take care.